Wait, so new JFK files, more JFK files, right? I mean, everybody's talking about them. These new ones just declassified. March 18th, was it?
Yeah, just a couple weeks ago.
So we're going to deep dive into those today. And specifically, we're going to focus on one of the, big questions always swirling around the JFK assassination of the CIA.
Right.
And specifically, we're not going to be looking into, did the CIA kill Kennedy? Like, that's not the question we're looking at today. We're going to be looking at potential indirect involvement.
Okay.
And we've got a lot of sources to go through here. Some of them are the government documents themselves released through that, JFK Records Act.
Right.
That's been going on for decades. And some related reports that kind of, help us piece things together. So we're going to explore the agency's anti-Castro operations, their connections to figures involved in those operations, a potential link to Oswald through a group that they were funding, and then this whole issue of what was withheld from the Warren Commission.
Yeah, should be interesting.
Yeah, so if you're finding this information valuable, please consider supporting Le Podcast de Philippe by, helping us reach 1,000 subscribers on YouTube today.
Yeah.
It really helps us out.
Absolutely.
So let's jump in. One of the things that immediately jumps out when you look at these documents is just how extensive the CIA's covert efforts were against Fidel Castro.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about like one or two isolated incidents here. This was a sustained campaign to try to assassinate him. And it started actually before Kennedy even took office.
Wow.
Back in the Eisenhower administration.
Okay.
And continued under Kennedy. Now, a lot of this activity is detailed in this file. 157-170-14-10242.
Catchy title.
Easy to remember. And it references some reporting from way back in 1971 by Jack Anderson, who was a pretty well-known journalist at the time.
Right. I mean, these weren't just like vague ideas of like, oh, we should, get rid of Castro. I mean, these were concrete plans. They were really trying to make this happen.
Oh, yeah. They brought in some very unsavory characters.
Like who?
Well, this file mentions mafia figures like John Rosselli.
Oh, wow.
Getting involved in these plots. And it's really striking when you look at the timing involved here, because on November 22nd, 1963, the very day that Kennedy was assassinated, a former Castro supporter was actually in the process of receiving a poison pen from the CIA.
No kidding.
And this detail is right there in that same file, 157-10014-10242.
That's wild. I mean, the timing of that is just
Suspicious.
Suspicious is a good word for it. Yeah, it really makes you wonder.
Yeah, and it leads to a pretty significant theory that's suggested by these files, which is that all of these aggressive anti-Castro operations may have inadvertently provoked a retaliatory response, and that ultimately resulted in Kennedy's assassination.
Okay, so you're saying like Castro basically, fought back?
Potentially, yeah. In fact, an attorney named Edward P. Morgan back in 1967, he actually suggested that there might have been a counterplot initiated by Castro himself.
Wow.
And then you have John Rosselli.
Yeah, one of the mob guys.
Exactly. And before he died, he reportedly claimed that the same individuals who were involved in those CIA plots against Castro were also the ones who were behind Kennedy's assassination.
Really?
Yeah, with Oswald as the trigger man that's documented in that same file, 157-157-10014-10242.
Okay, so we got the mob, we got Castro, maybe, possibly.
Yeah.
And, Rosselli's death is pretty suspicious too, right?
Oh, yeah. Very suspicious. And it was reported on by the Washington Post back in August of 76. And there's reference to it in that same file. Rosselli wound up murdered under very mysterious circumstances.
Okay, so we've got this web of intrigue and potential connections here.
Yeah.
And, it makes you think about the CIA's involvement with another group, the Student Revolutionary Directorate, or DRE.
Yeah, so the DRE, this was a vehemently anti-communist Cuban student group, and file 104, 10181, 10117, a memo from a guy named Calvin Thomas, confirms that the CIA was funding them.
Okay, so the CIA is funding this group that really hates Castro and wants to get rid of him?
Exactly, and what's interesting is that the DRE had a representative in New Orleans, and that representative had contact with Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oh, wow.
So that creates an indirect connection between Oswald and an organization that the CIA was supporting.
So we've got the CIA trying to kill Castro. We've got individuals who are involved in those plots, potentially connected to Kennedy's assassination. And now we have this link between the CIA and Oswald.
It's quite a tangled web.
It is. And that same memo that you mentioned, it indicates that some within the DRE leadership even had some pretty strong resentment towards Kennedy.
That's right, although the specific individual who felt that way was no longer in a leadership position by 1963.
Right. So with all of this going on, it really raises the question of, what did the CIA know and when did they know it? And were they fully transparent with everything that they were doing?
Yeah, and that's where this issue of withheld information comes in.
Right.
because file 157-17-14-10242 reveals that the CIA actually withheld critical evidence from the Warren Commission.
Really?
Yeah, this included details about their collaboration with the Mafia in those plots to assassinate Castro.
So they were working with the mob,
Yeah.
and they didn't tell the Warren Commission.
Nope. And the files say that the reason they did this was to protect the secrecy of those operations
Okay.
and to prevent potential public outrage.
I mean, can you imagine if that had come out during the Warren Commission?
You would have been huge.
Yeah, so Alan Dulles, the former CIA director, the one who authorized the Castro plots, he ends up serving on the Warren Commission.
Right.
And according to these files, he never revealed any of this collaboration.
Nope. Stayed silent.
And then on top of that, there's a cable from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City shortly after the assassination,
Right.
suggesting Cuban involvement and CIA Director John McCone. He briefed President Johnson about this. But neither of these pieces of information were given to the Warren Commission.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant omission.
Yeah, I mean, this is big stuff that they were keeping from the official inquiry.
It is, but it's really important to remember that even with all of these connections and the withheld information, there's no smoking gun in these files. There's no direct evidence that definitively proves that the CIA planned or carried out Kennedy's assassination themselves.
Okay.
File 104-10332-1009 actually includes an excerpt from a 2020 program back in 1993.
Okay.
And in it, Gerald Posner, he refers to KGB files that indicate there's no direct CIA link to Oswald.
Okay, so no smoking gun, but we've got these intense anti-Castro activities, the claims linking those involved to Kennedy's murder, the connection to Oswald through the DRE, and the fact that information was hidden from the Warren Commission.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And file 104-10433-10249 even talks about these broader conspiracy theories.
Right. I mean, there's no shortage of theories out there.
No kidding. And it just shows you how complex this whole thing is. There's not one simple explanation.
Exactly. It's not about finding that one piece of evidence that solves everything.
Okay.
It's about looking at all these circumstantial details and seeing what kind of picture they paint.
Right. And in this case, they paint a pretty interesting picture.
They do, because even if the files don't definitively prove that the CIA was directly involved in the assassination plot,
Right.
they do suggest that there was potential for them to have indirectly influenced the events leading up to November 22nd, 1963.
So let's recap here because we covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Sure.
We've seen pretty clear evidence that the CIA had this extensive and aggressive campaign against Fidel Castro.
Mm-hmm.
We've looked at theories suggesting that maybe those operations unintentionally triggered a retaliatory attack against Kennedy. We've also explored that indirect connection between the CIA and Lee Harvey Oswald through the DRE, the group they were funding.
Right.
And then the fact that the CIA didn't tell the Warren Commission about everything they were doing, that's huge.
Absolutely. And while we have to emphasize again that these documents don't offer conclusive proof that the CIA was directly involved in planning Kennedy's assassination,
Right.
all this circumstantial evidence that we've discussed, it really does raise some serious questions.
It does. It really makes you think. And, it leaves us with something to consider.
Okay.
So for all of you listening out there, think about this. Given what we've learned from these newly declassified files, what does it tell us about the challenges of really understanding history,
Yeah.
especially when we're talking about events that happened decades ago?
It's tough to get the full picture.
Right. And how do we figure out the impact of indirect actions versus direct actions?
Right, because sometimes those indirect actions can have huge unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And that's something to think about as we try to grapple with these pivotal moments in history.
Definitely.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the JFK files.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.